kind of work that it tries to promote. And it is good. It is here in Saskatchewan as well as in Winnipeg. So you've got the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, you've got Frontier here, and Ames out in Atlantic Canada. So it is a wonderful development that we should have this kind of think tank and this kind of organization prompting debate right here on the prairies. Go ahead with lunch. Don't wait for me, because I'm going to take your time.
By all means.
I was trying to explain what human rights commissions are like to an advertising salesman last week. Unless you think that's a cheap shot at the expense of the advertising department in the newspaper, and I know that you have quite a contingent from the New York Post here today, I'm pleased to welcome you. No, it's just that the advertising department doesn't actually believe in free speech. You go to Nigel Hannaford, he'll write about your stuff, and it won't charge you anything. Go to the advertising department and you buy an ad. It costs you lots. So they don't believe in free speech. So the discussion was, what is the Human Rights Commission? Why are you so exercised about it? And I'd like to sum it up in two propositions. First of all, they are a second tier of justice. This is a country which will not have a two-tier health system, but it seems to put up with a two-tier justice system just fine, thank you. And the second thing is that when you get in trouble with the Human Rights Commission, it is usually because it is not that you said anything hateful, it is that somebody hated what you said. And if you think about it, there is quite a subtle distinction there. So, I'll regale you with a couple of little stories out of English history, and then we'll bring it back to 21st century Canada. Anybody ever heard of the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins? This was a fellow who would ride around England in the turbulent period right after our Civil War in the middle of the 17th century. And he would arrive in some little country village, and there'd be an old woman sitting by the well, and he'd say, "Are you a witch?" And she would say, "No, of course not." And he would say, "Well, let's find out." And so they would tie her up, throw her in the duck pond, and if she sank, oh, it was our mistake. Clearly, she was not a witch. But if she floated, why? It was self-evident. Even the very earth was rejecting her. Must be a witch, and she'd be burned at the stake. And that individual, I'm telling the story in a light-hearted manner, but over 200 mostly old women came to their sad end in the 17th century in just such a way. The thing about that story is this: to be accused was to be guilty. You had no chance. And then the second story, also from bygone days in England, is the Star Chamber. 500 years ago, the English courts were dominated by the aristocracy. They weren't very efficient anyway, and they were certainly corrupt. Henry VII, one of the good kings in English history, established the Star Chamber to give his subjects direct access to him. Got a problem with the Lord of the Manor? Come to the King's Justice at the Star Chamber. A very good idea in the circumstances, and a very effective one. Justice was quick, it was efficient, and the penalties were not onerous. But justice was done. However, things being what they are, even the best ideas can be corrupted. Sure enough, in a couple of hundred years, the kings had decided that this was altogether too useful to give up. And it became an instrument of repression. It became the king's personal court. So you then ended up with two parallel streams of justice, which didn't talk to each other. One handled by the king, re the state, and the other, which was the regular justice system, such as it was. There again, you have this two-tiered approach. Now I bring you forward to Canada in the 21st century, and I want to talk to you about the difference between the courts, which deal under the Canadian Criminal Code, and the human rights tribunals, which do not. Every province has a human rights commission, by the way, and the federal government has one as well. So there's a total of 11 of these things out there. And I want to just say at the outset that, like the original Star Chamber, the concept of the Human Rights Commission is sound. It was founded for a good and noble purpose, and I am not here to recommend that human rights commissions be disbanded. However, about 15 years ago, in addition to giving quick administrative justice to people who felt they'd been discriminated in accommodation or employment or access to services, which was the original noble purpose of human rights commissions. In addition to that, they took on the role of censoring speech. Virtually every commission had a paragraph added to its legislation, its enabling legislation, which read to the effect that it should be against the law to publish certain types of material, including newspaper articles, and including radio broadcasts, that were likely to expose an identifiable minority to hatred or contempt. Now notice the use of the word likely. It doesn't actually have to happen. Nobody needs to be hurt, harmed, but the offense is to publish something that could, in somebody's opinion. And of course that somebody is the person who is conducting the tribunal appointed by the Human Rights Commission. Now if you end up in, let's say you say something that's on the edge, and you go to court under the Canadian Criminal Code, you have several defenses. You can say, well look, Your Honor, what I said was true. That is a defense, to a degree. It's not an unlimited one, be found, but it is a defense to a degree, and you can certainly offer it. You can say that it was a fair comment, that a reasonable person, believing the facts that were available, could come to that conclusion. You could say that you had no evil intent, it was an inadvertent comment. If you end up in front of a tribunal, a human rights tribunal, you have none of those defenses. But, incidentally, the chap who is complaining at you is not meeting his own expenses of prosecution. That's being done by the state. You have to meet yours, just as you would in court, but he's getting a free ride. So the system tends to encourage complaints, and it does so in a forum where the respondent has virtually nothing to fight with. Like the old woman by the well, when Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, showed up, there really isn't a whole lot you can do about it. So you find yourself trapped in this second tier of justice, which in fact you will see later is not justice at all. It's an attempt to impose a template upon public discourse. Now, why would you care? Let's see now. The people who find themselves in trouble in front of the Human Rights Commissions are usually anti-Semites. They're homophobic. They're usually poorly educated, not inevitably so, but usually poorly educated people who are perhaps trapped in the paradigms of a bygone age. And maybe we're even doing a good thing by making them think over what it is that they say they believe. Why should we care? Well, I'm not saying you should, but I am saying that even people like that deserve due process. Somebody is accused of the worst kind of murder, even Paul Bernardo, Clifford Olson, those people all have their day in court under the morals and practices of the Canadian justice system, according to the Canadian Criminal Code. As we just discussed, you have no protections in a human rights tribunal. So, if it's not just those guys, however, it can be anybody. Right now, the case that energizes me in this whole debate is that of Mark Stein. 2 years ago, Mark Stein published a book, America Alone. Anybody read it? Okay, a few of you. There's a chapter in there in which he discusses the increasing influence of Islam in Europe as a result of increasing immigration from Arabic countries to Europe. And he rightly asks the question, well, what's this going to do with the culture? This article, this chapter appeared as an article in Maclean's magazine and became the object of complaints from a group of Islamic students at Osgoode Hall. That's one of the major legal teaching schools in Canada, and they complained, along with the Canadian Islamic Congress, that they were being discriminated against on the basis of religion as a result of Maclean's producing this article. Well, what is the possibility of having a discussion about the future of this country if you cannot talk about other cultures and how they may impact the culture that we have already established here? For that was the point of interest, even though the article itself discussed Europe. What made it relevant to Canada and made it of interest for the claims to print it was that the same thing is happening here. We have an immigration program. When people come in with other ideas, how does that affect the culture that we have here? I mean, this is not an idle comment. We have already had some discussion in Ontario about the introduction of Sharia law, for example. Therefore, Maclean's had a legitimate interest in putting this type of an article in front of people to foster debate about immigration. And yet there are people who don't want that point of view heard. They have the instrument of the Human Rights Commission before them to suppress the discussion. I would actually put it to you this way. Do you realize that your own Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission has not one, not two, not three, but 14 prohibited grounds of discrimination? That means there are 14 areas of public policy where you would need to be careful how you phrase things. Here they are, all race, religion. These are the original ones. Race, religion, color, sex, nationality, ancestry, place of origin, creed, marital status, family status, disability, receipt of public assistance, and since 1993, sexual orientation. So, what is it, for instance, about the receipt of public assistance that should be so offensive that we have to be restrained from making observations about people on welfare? Is it that, how do you have the discussion if that to even raise the possibility that some people who are on welfare maybe shouldn't be, is to perhaps bring an identifiable group, that is welfare recipients, into hatred or contempt? I think we've all heard enough about sexual orientation in the last few years to last us a lifetime. But again, there are actually public health implications to certain types of sexual behavior. How is it that that can't be discussed except on the terms of those who are engaging in that kind of behavior? So you have whole areas of the greater area of public policy debate that are just carved off. You can't talk about the gays, you can't talk about the Zion, you can't talk about Israel, you can't talk about Muslims, if the Muslims have their way in the Stein case. The welfare recipients would have you leave them alone, and so it goes on through 4 different areas. It is very hard to have an informed public debate in that kind of an atmosphere. I could give you a lengthy history of where human rights commissions came from and why they are the way they are. And I'm going to actually leave that to the question time that I'm sure will follow. But I would like to give you a couple of hopeful thoughts about this situation we find ourselves in. Some people who have offended the Human Rights Commission are hard to defend. They are not people that you want to have to dinner. They're not people who you want to spend time with. They're certainly not people whose ideas you want to defend. Nevertheless, they have a right to due process, and what we have been waiting for is somebody whose situation commands greater public sympathy. And I think when you look at Stein's situation, when you look at the situation of Ezra Levant, prosecuted because he republished certain cartoons that had been an object of public interest around the world, I think you understand there that this is something we can all relate to. We are talking to think about the future cultural direction of our country. And we have, I believe, a window of opportunity. How, in fact, then can we use it? There are two things that need to happen. The first is that human rights tribunals have to be denormalized. Right now, there's general acceptance. How do you denormalize a human rights tribunal? Well, I would invite you to click onto Ezra Levant's website and watch what he has done with that. Ezra Levant was, figuratively speaking, marched off to the police station. He was put in front of a human rights investigating officer and asked to explain himself, which he did at length and with cutting wit, and reduced the human rights officer to incoherence. They could not answer his arguments. That website, when I last asked, has been hit by over 558,000 buttons. That's a lot of people who have seen and heard Ezra Levant offer the free speech argument in the human rights tribunal setting. He is powerful and persuasive. A further aspect of denormalization has come out of a recent case in Ontario where a man by the name of Mark Lemire, described in the media as a neo-Nazi and an extreme rightist and those sorts of things. I don't pick that up from his website, but at any rate, he's clearly a conservative point of view that he portrays on his website. At any rate, Mark Lemire has been prosecuted by the Canadian Human Rights Commission for anti-Semitic statements, amongst others. And in the course of the inquiry, it has emerged that the Canadian Human Rights Commission has acted as a gumshoe police service. They have misrepresented themselves. They have invented internet identities for themselves. They, on one occasion, attempted to and succeeded in hijacking a wireless feed. People who are better able to explain the technicalities of how wireless internet hookups can, and I know we've got a couple of people from a communications company here in the room that probably tell me how this was done. But at any rate, there was a young woman living across the street from the CHRC offices. She had a wireless feed. She didn't have a password on it, and these guys were able to tap into it. The whole idea being, with their secret identity and what they believed was a non-traceable computer, they would put provocative comments on this man's website in the hope that he would either agree with them, take the bait, or in some other way incriminate himself. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we have is an agency of the Canadian state acting as an agent provocateur, tempting people to break the law, rather than attempting to restrain them from doing so. When that story broke, there was considerable justifiable outrage around Canada. And the last chapter in that particular story has yet to be written. But I would put it to you that if we have a rogue agency trying to entrap Canadians, if we have an agency that cannot justify itself before a determined questioner, who is not an ignorant person, who is not a poorly schooled, but a man, but a bright, articulate lawyer, then I would say that that goes a long way to denormalizing the human rights commissions and showing that these particular emperors, if not completely naked, are certainly lightly clothed. The second part of trying to do something about this situation is that we have to create the atmosphere for politicians to move. Politicians, with all due respect to the two of them here at the table, Politicians cannot afford to be brave in normal circumstances. They need the support, they need the initiation of the public. For Stephen Harper, for instance, to take to jump up and in Parliament and say what's happening in the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which is the only one that he can deal with, is terrible. We must legislate, we must remove from it the power to censor speech. Will only invite the opposition to say, well, Mr. Harper, which human rights are you going to go after next week if we give you this one? It's not something that the minority government can do. It's not even something that the majority government would want to do willingly unless it felt it had the support of the people. But this is the solution. Human rights commissions do have a legitimate purpose, but that purpose does not include censoring speech. It does not include censoring writing. It does not include censoring websites. These are things that can be restrained, if they need restraining at all, by the hate crime provisions of the Canadian Criminal Code, where people at least have a chance to defend themselves properly before a duly appointed court. The solution is to remove the offending paragraphs from each of the provincial human rights code. In Saskatchewan, just for your information, it's section 14, number 1. I'll read it to you. It's interesting wording. Under your Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, section 14.1 proclaims a ban on publication of, quote, any notice, sign, symbol, emblem, article, statement, or other representation which exposes or tends to expose the hatred, ridicules, belittles, or otherwise affronts the dignity of any person or class of persons on the basis of a prohibited ground, which, as we discussed earlier, is now up to 14 prohibited grounds. That needs to go, because it certainly is not protected by the next sentence, which says, by the way, nothing in subsection 1 restricts the right of freedom of speech under the law on any subject. Well, nothing means nothing, but clearly it means nothing at all when the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission adjudicates people like Hugh Owens or Bill Wapcott for just stating their point of view on, incidentally, matters of public policy that were before legislatures at the time they made the statements. These guys might have rabble raising on old municipal business. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to sum it up, we have to remove the legislation that enables human rights commissions to censor speech. That can only be done by denormalizing them and allowing the space for politicians to move. And when we have done that, we will go a long way to getting rid of something that I don't understand how Canadians can support, which is the two-tier justice system. These are the things that have to happen. I'm going to leave you with this thought. I don't usually quote John Ralston's all, but you know, I am hugely he had it right. He said, free speech, not a pleasant nor an easy thing, but perhaps the single most important element in any democracy. Free speech is afflicted by two widely held contradictory opinions. The first is that we have it. The second, that it is a luxury.